here's a question for you: could Donald Trump be right about something? Okay, we're going to talk about that and a couple other issues with our next guest. Dean Baker is a well-known economist. He's been on the show before. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research and the author of a number of books, including Getting Back to Full Employment, A Better Bargain for Working People, and The End of Loser Liberalism, Making Markets Progressive. Dean, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
So listen, you wrote a piece recently entitled Trump and Trade, He's Largely Right. And let's talk about that for a second, because we're most of us around this show anyway are pretty appalled by Mr. Trump in general, but some of us have been fighting to change U.S. trade policy for a long time against a kind of bipartisan current of so-called free trade. But, they used to say, the right wing used to say, freedom ain't free, and I don't think free trade is really free either. So, first of all, let's define what the consensus view means when they use the term free trade, deals like NAFTA and so on. What does that really mean?
Well, these are trade deals that are very much distorted to help business, and I would say to redistribute income upward. I mean, I wrote another book that just came out, Rigged, how globalization and the rules of the market economy were designed to redistribute income upward. And these deals are a central part of that. So what NAFTA and other trade deals have been about is putting U.S. manufacturing workers in direct competition with low-paid workers in the developing world. And the predicted and actual result of that is a loss of manufacturing jobs and downward pressure on the wages of the workers who are still employed here. And that's not surprising. I mean, that's economic theory, so it's not like I've got some radical reinterpretation. That is what is supposed to happen, and it has happened. Other parts of the deal are not all free trade in the sense that we have rules that strengthen and lengthen patent and copyright protection, big issue here, prescription drugs. Protection is not free trade. So we're trying to make other countries pay more for prescription drugs to Pfizer and Merck and our other drug companies. Same for Microsoft and software. And then we have a lot of pro-business regulations on things like investor rights. So investors, this is part of NAFTA, foreign investors have the right to sue in the United States if they feel that they haven't been treated fairly in special courts. So they could always go to U.S. court, and that's not an issue. But they have a special tribunal, and some people may recall that the company that was doing the XL pipeline filed a suit for $30 billion against the United States when Obama canceled it. Now, since Trump's giving them a green light again, I gather the suit's off. But in any case, that's the sort of thing that is in those trade deals. Has very little to do with free trade, and in some ways, as I say, even antithetical to free trade.
Right. Isn't free trade one of those terms, sort of master terms of art, in that what you're describing isn't really free? I mean, this extrajudicial court system that you described, the ISDS, I think it's called, it's really a way of taking away the sovereignty of independent nations and their courts, the way I see it, and creating a sort of corporate substitute for that. So if it's not really free trade we're talking about, if it's really something else, a sort of investor privileged or financial sector privileged, corporate privileged system of trade, then isn't it surprising in a way, for one thing, that Trump, who in so many ways seems oligarchical, he's got a cabinet of many billionaires, he's wants to cut taxes for billionaires and corporations and so on, and yet on trade, he seems to be breaking with the sort of corporate orthodoxy a little bit. Do you think that's true?
Well, his rhetoric, it's certainly true. So he was going around the industrial Midwest, and I'm sure this got him a lot of votes. He was going around Ohio and Michigan, Pennsylvania, saying, those trade deals cost you jobs, and I'm going to bring them back. So that's completely against the corporate line. He did say some other things that were, he said he's going to protect Social Security and Medicare. The other Republicans are all saying they want to cut them, privatize them. He's going, no, I'm going to, we don't have to do that. People earn those. They need those benefits. So he was saying some things that very much resonated with sort of typical workers. They need their Social Security, they need their Medicare, and he's saying, I'm going to bring your jobs back. Now, does he have a way to do it? I sort of doubt it, but I'll just put it this way, if he does, he still hasn't shared it with anyone. But the rhetoric was certainly very much at odds with what U.S. corporations have been looking to for the last quarter century.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a divergence between the way he's handled his promises on Medicare and Social Security, for example, and his promises on trade. But I wanted to talk to you about that. And again, we're talking with economist Dean Baker about Trump and trade. On Social Security and Medicare, he promised to protect those programs, which made him stand out in the Republican presidential field. But his appointees, including his budget director and his head of Health and Human Services, have a long record of wanting to cut those programs. So he's kind of going against his own campaign and with the corporate and the Republican grain on his appointees. So to me, in my mind, it casts doubts on what he will do about those programs. But when it comes to trade, it seems as if at least a certain percentage of his appointments, for example, his special trade representative, Lighthizer, the guy that he's identified for that position, and a couple other folks, Wilbur Ross, who is in line to become Commerce Secretary. It seems that these people, whatever their other virtues or lack thereof, kind of hew to the Trump line on trade a little bit. But am I right about that, you think?
Well, they certainly don't correspond to conventional free traders. So many of them have, raised similar points to Trump, saying that we should be concerned more about jobs in the U.S. How that flies in terms of one actual policy they put forward, it's very, very hard to say. I mean, Trump seems to think that he's going to bring jobs back by doing like what he did with Carrier, where he ostensibly saved, again, let's give him credit, I have no idea whether he really did save any jobs, 700-800 jobs, great for those people. But in an economy where we have over 12 million manufacturing jobs, that just doesn't go very far. So what exactly does he plan to do? I mean, I could tell him things I would like to see him do. I'd like to see him focus on currency, get the value of the dollar down against other major currencies. He does occasionally talk about that, but not consistently, and he seems very confused. There was a story in the paper about how he'd called his then national security advisor at 3 a.m. This is Michael Flynn, who's been forced out. They called him at 3 a.m. and said, do we want a high dollar, do we want a low dollar? And why he'd call his national security advisor, I have no idea. Why he'd call him at 3 a.m. is rather strange. But how he couldn't know that, that's sort of disconcerting. But, in any case, I really have no idea where he plans to go. He's saying some of the right things, but he's saying a lot of very strange things.
And of course, that was a strange incident because it suggests that not only doesn't he know the difference between an economist and a national security person, but more disturbingly, it suggests that in his mind, economic issues, global economic issues, and national security issues are indistinguishable. And while there's a lot of overlap, I would not argue that they're indistinguishable. But let's talk for a second about the value of the dollar. Specifically, you mentioned, what he could do there to create more jobs by devaluing the dollar a little bit, so American goods are more affordable. But he talks a lot about currency and the Chinese, and in a fairly bellicose way. Is he right there, or is he wrong?
He's partially right. So here's the basic story. Has China been deliberately trying to keep its currency down to give them an advantage in trade? To my view, that's absolutely true. We could argue how much they've done that. Are they still doing it? There's some more complex issues I can go into, but it'd take a little more time. So let me just leave that on the table and say they certainly have done that. That's been a big factor in the U.S. trade deficit with China. And I'll just add to that, they're not the only country that does that. So we have trade deficits with other countries in part because they do similar actions. Now the question is, how do you deal with that? He makes this battle, China's winning, we're losing. It's not China winning. And I think I've raised this issue on your show before, that there are U.S. companies that benefit from an undervalued Chinese currency. So Walmart is able to import a lot of goods at very low cost from China and win against their competitors because China's currency is undervalued. General Electric sets up manufacturing operations in China. Again, they benefit from that. So this isn't a case of China winning, the U.S. losing. It's some actors in China winning. It's some actors in the U.S. winning. U.S. workers clearly lose. But it's not that China's winning, the U.S. is losing. And if he doesn't understand that, then it's very hard to see how you turn that around. And then on top of that, he makes this big public show, I'm going to beat up China, well, we can't really beat up China. We have to negotiate with China. We might be able to beat up Honduras or, Guatemala. There's poor countries in the world that, sure, we could push them around. I might not like that, but that's the reality. We can. We can't do that with China. So the question is, okay, we're going to negotiate with them. My list is, first and foremost, I want you to raise the value of your currency. Here's a timeline. Let's see you do that. And we have to give up things. So we can't tell them. Trump also complains they don't respect our copyrights. They don't give access to our financial industry. He's got a long list of things. He can't just go to China and go, here's 10 things I want you to do. They'll just laugh at him. He could say, okay, I want you to do one thing. These other things we could talk about, they're less important. And we'll do some, we'll make some concessions to you. It's negotiation. He doesn't seem to understand that. And again, I'm no expert in international relations, but it just seems kind of common sense. He's more likely to be able to win in negotiations if he does it quietly, if he goes there and say, hey, we have these issues, and negotiates quietly rather than make this big public display, which would make it more difficult for China's leaders to back down.
Well, that's a great point. And also we have, on top of that, the notion that maybe it's more about political posturing than anything else. Although, I can't read Donald Trump's mind. I honestly don't know what drives him or motivates him. But I also think you make a great point that while he's demonizing China, the fact is that this is really as much an inequality issue as it is an international issue. Fair statement?
Very much so. And again, we have to understand our trade that way. It's not us against China. It's not us against Mexico. It's some people in the U.S. against other people in the U.S. And again, same story in the other countries. There's winners and losers in China and Mexico from our trade deals.
So, I wanted to quickly talk with you, Dean Baker, about one other area before we go, which is you wrote a piece on globalization recently where, among other things, you started out by saying, while we cannot accept the racism and misogyny of the Trump victory, behind the Trump victory, which I certainly agree with, we must recognize that white working class voters who largely supported him have real grievances. They have been economic losers over the last 4 decades. So as you've watched the first appointments unfold in the Trump administration, the first set of hearings go through, and his initial halting steps, do you have any sense of whether he sincerely plans to address any of those grievances, or whether this was more demagoguery than anything else? Because I tend to agree with you, and I think it's a huge mistake for Democrats to dismiss all his voters as deplorables and so on. I think that there are real economic grievances there. Maybe that caused people to vote for him. Maybe it caused other people to stay home. But do you have any sense that there's anything he's going to do to help these people? I mean, his infrastructure plan, I haven't heard anything specific. Steve Bannon says, no, it's not going to be tax breaks. They're going to spend money. But Trump himself has been silent on trade and other issues. There's been rhetoric, but very little action. Do we have any sense of this guy, whether this guy is going to do anything to help the voters he promised so much to, or is it just too early to tell?
I'd say what we've seen today is certainly pointing very much in the opposite direction. I mean, he's appointed Wall Street people to the top positions, the National Economic Council, the Treasury, several other top positions, not just Wall Street people, Goldman Sachs alums. So he was beating up on Goldman Sachs and going after Hillary Clinton for getting $250,000 for speaking there, which I wasn't happy about either, but whatever. He's appointing the people to the top positions. His Labor Department, of course, his first pick as Labor Secretary had to resign because of, a number of issues. But in any case, certainly he was not someone committed to enforcing labor laws on behalf of workers. So I don't think there's much cause for optimism. But getting back to the initial point, I mean, I think there is a really, really important point we have to fight about here. I don't mean you and me. I mean against a lot of other people.
Hey, I'll fight.
Tagging of you as saying, oh, you sound like Donald Trump.
Right.
That's not grounds for dismissing it. As far as I know, Donald Trump thinks the world is round. Right. I'm not going to go around saying it's flat so I could disagree with Donald Trump. And saying that manufacturing workers have been screwed and basically workers without college degrees, and that piece I was saying white workers because they were the ones who voted for Trump, but basically workers without college degrees, that's black workers, Hispanic workers, they have been screwed by policy over the last 4 decades. And that happens to be true. And we have to say that as loudly, as clearly as we can. And if Donald Trump happens to occasionally say that too, well, that's fine. That doesn't change it from being true.
Yeah, I think that I think that's a great point to end on. And the fact is, he managed to tap into some genuine frustrations. And if it turns out, as appears to be the case, that it was demagoguery, Democrats still ignore the issue and the crisis people are experiencing at their own peril. So, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. But Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, as always, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me on.